This is a story about two cities so full of cruelty and pride that the echoes of their wickedness reached all the way to heaven. It is a story of fire from the sky, of a last-minute escape, and of one last, forbidden look that cost a woman everything. The day it all began felt like any other. The sun was a hot, white coin in a cloudless sky, beating down on the plains of Mamre. Dust devils danced in the distance, and the air was thick and still. Under the shade of the great oak trees, a man named Abraham sat near the entrance of his tent. He was old now, his beard as white as sheep's wool, his skin weathered like ancient leather from a lifetime under the Middle Eastern sun. He was a man of great wealth, with flocks and herds that stretched as far as the eye could see. But more than that, he was a man of great faith, a friend of God. As the heat of the day reached its peak, a time when all sensible creatures sought shelter, Abraham lifted his eyes. There, standing on the dusty path before him, were three men. They were just there. They had not made a sound, and in the shimmering heat, they seemed to have appeared out of thin air. They looked like weary travelers, their robes coated with the dust of a long journey, their faces unfamiliar. But something about them was different. There was a quiet authority in their posture, a stillness that did not belong to ordinary men. Abraham's heart, wise and discerning, sensed this at once. He didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for them to speak. He pushed himself to his feet, his old bones protesting, and ran from his tent door to meet them. Running was a young man's game, but honor demanded it. He bowed low to the ground, his forehead touching the earth in the deepest sign of respect. "My lord," he said, addressing the one who seemed to be the leader, "if I have found favor in your sight, please do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree." His words tumbled out, full of the ancient and sacred duty of hospitality. In this harsh and unforgiving land, to turn away a stranger was a great shame. To welcome one was a blessing. "Let me get you something to eat," Abraham continued, "so you can be refreshed and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant." The men did not seem surprised by his generosity. They simply looked at him with calm, knowing eyes. The leader spoke, his voice steady and clear. "Do as you have said." That was all the encouragement Abraham needed. He hurried back into the tent to his wife, Sarah. She was old, too, well past the age of bearing children, and the lines of a long life were etched around her eyes. "Quick," Abraham said to her, his voice filled with urgency. "Get 3 seahs of the finest flour, knead it, and bake some bread." This was not a small amount. It was enough to feed a small army, a testament to the honor he felt for these guests. Sarah, accustomed to her husband's grand gestures of faith and hospitality, went to work immediately. The rhythmic sound of her hands kneading the dough filled the quiet of the tent. But Abraham was not finished. He ran out to the herd, his mind racing. He needed to provide the very best. He selected a calf, young and tender and good, and gave it to a servant, telling him to prepare it quickly. The servant understood the urgency and rushed off to do as he was told. Abraham then took curds and milk, the fresh, cool staples of a shepherd's life, and the calf that had been prepared, and the fresh, warm bread Sarah had baked. He set all of it before the 3 mysterious visitors who sat in the cool shade of the oak tree. He didn't sit with them. Instead, he stood by them, under the tree, a humble servant ready to attend to their every need while they ate. The silence was profound. The only sounds were the gentle rustling of leaves and the soft sounds of the men eating the feast Abraham had provided. Abraham watched them, his heart full of a strange mix of reverence and curiosity. Who were these men? They ate like mortals. They looked like mortals, but he felt an aura of power around them that was anything but mortal. Finally, after they had finished their meal, the leader looked up at Abraham. "Where is your wife, Sarah?" he asked. The question was simple, but it felt deeply significant. How did he know her name? Abraham had not mentioned it. "She is in the tent," Abraham replied, his voice barely a whisper. Then the man made a promise so impossible, so staggering, that the world seemed to tilt on its axis. "I will surely return to you about this time next year," he said, his eyes meeting Abraham's, "and Sarah your wife will have a son." Now, Sarah was just inside the tent entrance, behind him. She was listening. She had heard everything. And when she heard those words, a sound escaped her lips. It was not a sound of joy or hope. It was a laugh, a quiet, bitter laugh of disbelief, hidden behind her hand. She thought to herself, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" The idea was absurd. Her body was long past its season of life. She and Abraham were like 2 ancient, withered trees that could no longer bear fruit. The hope for a child had died in her heart decades ago, a quiet grief she had learned to live with. To hear it spoken of now felt like a cruel joke. But the one who had spoken was no ordinary man. He turned his gaze from Abraham directly toward the tent, as if he could see right through the goat hair cloth and into Sarah's very heart. Why did Sarah laugh? He asked Abraham, though the question was clearly meant for her. Why did she say, "Will I really have a child, now that I am old?" A cold wave of fear washed over Sarah. He had heard her. He had heard not just her laugh, but her secret thoughts. The man's voice was not angry, but it was filled with a power that made the air tremble. He asked a question that would echo down through the ages, a question that challenged every doubt and every fear. Is anything too hard for the Lord? And in that moment, the truth crashed down upon Abraham and Sarah. This was not just a traveler. This was not just an honored guest. This was God himself, standing in their midst, under their tree. They were in the presence of the creator of the universe. The promise was not a foolish dream. It was a divine decree. "I will return to you at the appointed time next year," he repeated, leaving no room for argument, "and Sarah will have a son." Sarah, terrified, stepped out from the tent. "I did not laugh," she lied, her voice trembling. She was afraid of what she had done, laughing at the promise of God. But he knew. "No," he said gently, but firmly. "You did laugh." And that was the end of it. The promise had been given. The doubt had been exposed. A new chapter in their lives was about to begin. But that was only the start of the reason for this divine visit. The promise of life was just one part of their mission. The other part was a mission of judgment. When the men got up to leave, they turned their faces toward the south, toward the fertile plain where two cities gleamed in the distance, Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham, ever the dutiful host, walked with them to send them on their way. As they walked, the Lord, still in the form of a man, spoke to the other two, who were angels. "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" He mused aloud. "Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him, so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him." It was as if God were reasoning with himself. He had made a covenant with this man, a promise to make him the father of many. He couldn't keep a secret of this magnitude from his friend. He had to tell him. So he turned to Abraham, and the warmth of the earlier promise was replaced by a chilling gravity. "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grievous that I am going down to see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know." The words hung in the hot, still air. An outcry, a grievous sin, a divine investigation. Abraham's heart went cold. His nephew, Lot, his brother's son, lived in Sodom. He had chosen that city for himself years ago, drawn by the lush, well-watered plains that looked like the very garden of the Lord. He had a wife, daughters, a home, a life there. The other two men, the angels, continued on the path toward Sodom, their figures slowly shrinking in the distance. But Abraham remained standing before the Lord. He was no longer just a host. He was now an intercessor, a man standing in the gap between God's perfect justice and the city that held his family. He took a hesitant step forward, his mind reeling. How could he, a man made of dust and ashes, speak to the Almighty about matters of judgment? But the love for his nephew was stronger than his fear. He began to speak, his voice thick with emotion. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it?" He was trembling, but he pressed on, his argument growing bolder. "Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right?" He had challenged God. He had appealed to God's own character, his own perfect justice. Abraham held his breath, his heart pounding against his ribs. The Lord's reply was immediate and filled with grace. "If I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake." A wave of relief washed over Abraham, but it was quickly followed by a new anxiety. 50? Was that too many? Sodom was a notoriously wicked place. Were there really 50 good people there? He had to press further. He had to be sure. "Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord," he said, his voice dropping in humility, "though I am nothing but dust and ashes, what if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5 people?" He was haggling. He was bargaining with God for the lives of a city. It was an act of incredible bravery and desperate love. And again, The Lord answered with mercy. If I find 45 there, he said, I will not destroy it. Abraham's hope grew. He saw an opening, a willingness in God to listen. So he spoke again. What if only 40 are found there? The Lord replied, For the sake of 40, I will not do it. Abraham could feel sweat beading on his forehead. He was walking a fine line. He didn't want to anger the Lord, to test his patience. May the Lord not be angry, he pleaded, but let me speak. What if only 30 can be found there? The answer came back, patient and unwavering. I will not do it if I find 30 there. 30. The number was shrinking. Abraham's mind raced. Lot, his wife, his daughters. Who else? Were there friends? Neighbors? Surely there could be 30 people who had not given themselves over completely to the city's darkness. But what if there weren't? He had to go lower. Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, he repeated his humble preface. What if only 20 can be found there? God's patience was as vast as the sky above them. For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it. Abraham's heart was in his throat. This was it. One last time. He knew he was pushing his luck, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. The lives of his family were at stake. May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more, he begged. What if only 10 are found there? 10. A tiny number. A single household, perhaps, and a few friends. Surely there could be 10. The Lord looked at Abraham, his friend, the man of dust and ashes who dared to stand before him and plead for mercy. And he gave his final, merciful answer. For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. And then he was gone. The Lord departed, and Abraham was left alone on the path, the silence of the plain rushing back in to fill the space where God had stood. He had done all he could. He had bargained the price of a city's survival down to a mere 10 souls. He turned and walked slowly back to his tent, a heavy prayer in his heart. Now, everything depended on those 2 angels, and on what they would find inside the walls of Sodom. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the land, the 2 angels arrived at the great gate of Sodom. The city was a different world from Abraham's quiet, orderly camp. It was a hive of activity, loud and chaotic. Merchants were packing up their stalls, soldiers were patrolling the walls, and citizens were milling about in the public square, their voices loud and their laughter sharp and mocking. Lot was sitting at the city gate, a place of business and social gathering. It was the duty of the city elders to sit there, and perhaps Lot, through his wealth, had achieved some position of status in his adopted home. When he saw the 2 approaching strangers, he saw what Abraham had seen. They were not ordinary men. Their faces were handsome and noble, and they carried themselves with a quiet dignity that was jarringly out of place in the coarse atmosphere of Sodom. He immediately remembered the customs of his homeland, the lessons of hospitality learned at Abraham's side. He stood up, and, just as his uncle had done, he bowed with his face to the ground. My lords, he said, his voice earnest, please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night, and then go on your way early in the morning. The angels, perhaps testing him, replied, No, we will spend the night in the square. But Lot knew the dangers of the city square after dark. He knew the character of the men of Sodom. It was no place for decent travelers. He insisted, pleading with them. Please, my lords, it is not safe. I beg you, come to my home. His urgency was real, and it convinced them. They saw in him a spark of the righteousness Abraham had spoken of. They went with him to his house. Inside, the home was an oasis of order in a city of chaos. Lot prepared a great feast for them, just as Abraham had done. He even baked bread without yeast, a sign of haste and special honor. The angels washed their feet and sat down to eat the meal he had prepared. Lot must have felt a sense of relief. He had rescued these men from the dangers of the street. He had done the right thing. He had honored them. But the peace was not to last. Before Lot and his guests had even laid down to rest for the night, a low rumble began outside. It started as a few angry voices, then grew into a murmur, and then a roar. Lot's heart froze. He knew that sound. He looked out a small window, and his blood ran cold. The street outside was filled with men, not just a few troublemakers, but all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old. They had surrounded his house, their faces lit by torches, twisted with rage and wicked intent. They were like a pack of wolves that had scented prey. They began to pound on the door, the heavy wood shuddering in its frame. Where are the men who came to you tonight? They shouted, their voices a vicious chorus. Bring them out to us so that we can know them. Their meaning was clear and grotesque. They wanted to humiliate and abuse these visitors, to violate the most sacred laws of hospitality. Lot was trapped. His worst fears about his city were being realized, right here on his own doorstep. He was a man caught between two terrors, the violent mob outside and the sacred duty to protect the guests under his roof. He had to do something. In a moment of sheer panic and desperation, he made a terrible choice. He went outside, shutting the door behind him to protect his guests, and faced the snarling crowd. "No, my friends," he begged, calling them friends in a desperate attempt to reason with them. "Don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof." It was a horrifying offer, a sign of how utterly terrified he was. In his broken thinking, sacrificing his own children seemed a lesser evil than allowing his guests to be harmed. But the men of Sodom were not interested in his offer. They were filled with contempt for him. "Get out of our way," they snarled. "This fellow came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play the judge. We'll treat you worse than them." They surged forward, grabbing Lot and pushing him back against his own door. They were about to break it down. Lot closed his eyes, bracing for the inevitable. He had failed. The mob was going to win. But then, suddenly, the door behind him opened. Strong hands reached out from the darkness of the house and pulled him inside, snatching him from the grasp of the mob. The door slammed shut with a deafening thud. Lot stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. He looked at his 2 guests. Their faces were no longer calm and serene. They were grim, their eyes blazing with a holy fire. These were not just men. They were warriors of heaven. The mob outside roared with frustration and began to throw their full weight against the door, trying to splinter the wood. But the angels were calm. One of them simply reached out a hand toward the door. And in an instant, a brilliant, searing flash of light erupted outside. The men who were pressing against the door screamed and fell back, clutching their eyes. All of them, from the youngest to the oldest, had been struck with a sudden, bewildering blindness. The shouting turned to cries of confusion and pain. They stumbled around, groping in the darkness they now inhabited, trying to find the door they could no longer see. They were completely helpless, their wicked intentions thwarted by a power they could not comprehend. Inside, the house was silent except for Lot's ragged breathing. The immediate danger was over, but the night's true terror was just beginning. The 2 angels turned to Lot. Their voices were low and urgent. "Do you have anyone else here? Sons-in-law, sons or daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you? Get them out of here." Lot stared at them, confused. "Get them out? What?" The angel's next words struck him with the force of a physical blow, confirming the dreadful purpose of their visit. "Because we are going to destroy this place. The outcry to the Lord against its people is so great that he has sent us to destroy it." The truth was laid bare. Abraham's negotiation had failed. There were not 10 righteous people in Sodom. There was only Lot, and even he was barely clinging to his righteousness. The judgment was no longer a distant possibility. It was here. It was now. The time for talk was over. The time to run had begun. Lot's mind raced. His sons-in-law, the men who were pledged to marry his 2 daughters. He had to warn them. He stumbled out of his house, leaving the blinded mob still groping in the street, and ran through the dark, chaotic city to the homes of his future sons. He burst in on them, his face pale with terror, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "Hurry! You have to get up and leave this place. The Lord is about to destroy the city." He must have looked like a madman. His clothes were disheveled, his eyes wide with a fear they couldn't understand. His sons-in-law looked at each other. They saw the chaos in the streets, but this? The Lord destroying the city? It sounded like a fantastic story, a bad dream. They smiled, then they chuckled, and then they laughed out loud. "You must be joking," one of them said, shaking his head. To them, Lot sounded like he was telling a ridiculous joke. They couldn't see the wickedness around them for what it was. They were part of it. They were comfortable in it. They refused to believe the warning. Defeated and heartbroken, Lot returned to his own house. He had failed to save them. The laughter of his sons-in-law echoed in his ears, a sound more chilling than the rage of the mob. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the angels grew more urgent. The sky was turning from black to a deep, bruised purple. Time was running out. "Hurry," they said to Lot. "Take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away when the city is punished." But Lot hesitated. He stood there in the middle of his house, looking around at the life he had built. his comfortable home, his possessions, his status in the city. He had lived here for so long that it had become a part of him. The thought of leaving it all behind, of running into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on his back, was overwhelming. He was frozen by indecision. The angels saw his hesitation, and their patience finally ran out. They could wait no longer. With swift, decisive movements, they seized him by the hand. They grabbed the hand of his wife and the hands of his 2 daughters. They didn't ask anymore. They didn't plead. They physically dragged the 4 of them out of the house and into the empty streets of the dawning city. The Bible says they did this because the Lord was merciful to him. Even in his hesitation, even in his attachment to a doomed world, God would not let him perish. He was being saved in spite of himself. They hauled the terrified family through the city gate and out onto the plain. The air was cool and fresh, a stark contrast to the suffocating evil they had left behind. Once they were clear of the city walls, the angels released them. Their final command was sharp and absolute. "Flee for your lives," one of them commanded, his voice like the crack of a whip. "Don't look back, and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be swept away." The instructions were simple. Run. Don't stop. Don't look back. Their very lives depended on it. But even now, facing certain doom, Lot tried to bargain. He looked at the distant, rugged mountains. They seemed so far away, so desolate. He was a man of the city, not a man of the wild. "No, my lords, please," he begged. "Your servant has found favor in your eyes, and you have shown me great kindness in sparing my life. But I can't flee to the mountains. This disaster will overtake me, and I'll die. Look, here is a small town nearby. It's a little one. Let me flee there. It is very small, isn't it? Then my life will be spared." He was pointing to a tiny town named Zor. It was a pathetic request, born of fear. He was still trying to cling to some semblance of the life he knew, even if it was just a tiny, insignificant town. And in a final, incredible act of grace, the angel agreed. "Very well," he said. "I will grant this request, too. I will not overthrow the town you speak of, but flee there quickly, because I cannot do anything until you reach it." The judgment of God on 2 entire cities was literally being held back, waiting for this one hesitant man and his family to get to safety. The weight of that reality spurred Lot into action. He grabbed his wife and daughters, and they began to run toward the little town of Zor. As they ran, the sun rose over the horizon. It was a beautiful, ordinary sunrise. The sky was filled with the soft colors of a new day, but it was the last sunrise Sodom and Gomorrah would ever see. Lot and his family reached the safety of Zor just as the first rays of sunlight touched the high walls of Sodom. And then it began. From his camp high in the hills, Abraham had risen early. He went to the place where he had stood before the Lord, his heart heavy with a mixture of hope and dread. He looked out across the plain toward the cities. At the same moment, Lot and his daughters, safe in Zor, looked back toward the home they had just fled. What they saw was beyond all imagination. The beautiful morning sky was ripped apart. The Lord rained down fire. Not ordinary fire, but burning sulfur, a thick, yellow, choking substance that fell from the sky like a torrent of liquid flame. It rained down upon Sodom and Gomorrah and upon the entire plain. The sound was a deafening, continuous roar, a sound of cosmic destruction. The ground shook. The very air seemed to be on fire. The lush, green plain, once compared to the garden of God, was instantly incinerated. The cities, with their high walls, their houses, their marketplaces, and all their people, were consumed. Everything that grew in the plain, every blade of grass, every tree, was turned to black ash. Lot and his daughters watched in horror, their faces illuminated by the terrible light of the inferno. They had escaped. They were alive. But Lot's wife, running just behind him, could not resist the pull of her old life. The command from the angel had been absolute. Don't look back. But her heart was still in Sodom. Her home was there. Her friends were there. All her possessions, the life she had known and loved, was being erased from the face of the earth. Perhaps it was disbelief. Perhaps it was a longing for what she had lost. Perhaps it was simple curiosity. But whatever the reason, she disobeyed. She slowed her steps, she hesitated, and she turned her head for one last look at the city she had called home. In that instant, the judgment she was fleeing from overtook her. The fiery, chemical rain, the superheated air thick with sulfur and salt from the nearby sea, enveloped her. Her forward motion stopped. Her final, regretful look was frozen on her face. Her body was instantly encased in a crust of salt and minerals, a stark, white pillar standing alone on the blackened plain. She became a permanent monument to the danger of a divided heart, a silent testament to the cost of looking back when God commands you to move forward. Lot did not see it happen. He kept running, dragging his daughters with him, not daring to look back until they were safely within the gates of Zoar. When he finally did look, all he saw was smoke. A thick, black column of smoke rising from the plain, blotting out the morning sun. From his vantage point, miles away, Abraham saw it too. The smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a great furnace. His heart sank. The deal was off. There were not 10 righteous people. His intercession had saved Lot, but it had not saved the cities. God's justice was as real and as terrible as his mercy. Lot and his 2 daughters were alone. They had lost everything: their home, their community, their family. They had even lost their mother to a single, fateful glance over her shoulder. They were the sole survivors of a catastrophe that had wiped their entire world off the map. They were safe, but they were scarred forever by the memory of the fire and by the lonely, silent pillar that stood as a permanent reminder of all they had lost. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is a chilling reminder of how seriously God takes sin. But it is also a story of his incredible patience and his desperate desire to save. He listened to Abraham's pleas. He sent angels to personally investigate. He physically dragged a hesitant man and his family to safety before the judgment fell. He showed mercy even in the midst of the most terrifying judgment. The story of Abraham's bold faith did not end here. It had only just begun.